Stanford University.
Okay, well, welcome to Stanford CS 193P Fall of 2017 and 18's lecture number 15. And today we have three topics for you. One is alerts and action sheets. So that's a way of kind of notifying the user when an extraordinary event happens, or to help your user make a branching decision where to go now in the app, where there's kind of, two or three choices of where they can go. Second thing we're going to talk about is notifications and KVO. That's a way of communicating blind and structured inside of our MVC. And then finally, I'm going to talk about the application lifecycle. We already talked about the view controller lifecycle. Now we're going to talk about the lifetime of your application. All right, so let's start with alerts and action sheets. These two things are very similar. The API to use them is almost identical, so I always talk about them together. They're a little bit different. An alert, it pops up in the middle of the screen. Okay, they're both modal. They kind of take over your screen, but alert pops up in the middle. Generally, whatever the alert is telling you or asking you, you're only going to have one or maybe two choices to respond. It would be unusual to have an alert even with three buttons in it. It's usually for asynchronous things like a network failure or something that happens out of the ordinary. You don't want to use an alert as just a way to talk to your user and ask them a yes or no question, things like that. Alerts are pretty disruptive to the user interface experience because they lock out the entire app and force you to deal with this thing. So it's not a primary kind of user interface element. It's more of an emergency situation, asynchronous, unusual, that kind of thing. Now an action sheet is similar in that it's modal, takes over the screen, but here you're almost always going to have more than two choices. Okay, this thing slides up from the bottom. You're going to usually have 2, 3, 4, 5 choices even. And here what you're doing is asking the user to make a branching decision. Maybe they've asked to take a picture, to get a picture in their app, and you want to know, do you want it from the camera, or do you want it from the photo library, or do you want it from somewhere else? So they're kind of branching right there, and you can't really help them until they make that decision for you. So that's what an action sheet is for. It's not like an alert in that it's for unusual circumstances. It's kind of normal branching decisions that you would have to make. So here's what these things look like. An action sheet slides up from the bottom like that and can have pretty much any number of buttons, although obviously you wouldn't want it to fill the whole screen. And then an alert, you've seen those. They come up in the middle of the screen. They might even have a little text field in them as well. Okay, so again, the API for them, i.e. using them, the code you write is almost identical. So let's just talk about one of them first, which is action sheet. Now, the way both of them work, they're just UI view controllers. Okay, there's nothing special about them, just UI view controllers. We learned about how to present a UI view controller modally in the last lecture when we put our emoji art controller document up modally. It took over the whole screen, okay, until we said done. Same thing here with alerts and action sheets, okay. This UI alert controller is a UI view controller, and we're just going to present it using exactly the same method we did to present our document, okay. It's called present. But we're not going to create it by getting it out of the storyboard like we did with our document. We're going to create it with this initializer, UI alert controller, title, message, preferred style. Okay, so the title is just the title. You can see on the left there the image where the title goes, right? It's the little thing at the top, redeploy Cassini, and then the message goes below that, issue commands to the Cassini guidance system. And then the preferred style is either action sheet or alert. Okay, so this is what it looks like for action sheet. Now you create your action sheet and then you want to add actions. Okay, these actions correspond to the buttons. So we have 4 actions right there in our example, what we're going to control Cassini here. And so we're going to have 4 times we're going to call add action. The argument to add action, there's only one argument. It's a UI alert action, okay, which is another object. And let's take a look at the initializer for UI alert action. It takes a title. That's going to be the title that appears on the button. A style. We'll talk about the styles in a moment here. And then a handler. And a handler is just a closure you're going to give it. It takes the action as an argument so that it's near at hand. And you're going to do whatever you do when that button gets clicked. So this alert and action sheets have a very simple API. You just put these buttons and the code that goes with them on each one. So this handler for our first button there, Orbit Saturn, was just kind of a normal button, so its style is UI alert action style.default. And the handler in there, I'm just going to go into orbit around Saturn. That's someone presumably pressed this button once, and Cassini did that. It's finished now, but it did that at one point. So this is just the normal default action here to orbit Saturn, right? And I could add another action, maybe explore Titan. Now, okay, that's not Cassini's mission, but maybe we could allow it if we make the person log in. So in the handler there, I've asked them to log in to verify they really want to divert Cassini to Titan, right? How about the next one, which is the close-up of the sun? Okay, well, if I really wanted to send this Cassini off to the sun, that would almost certainly destroy Cassini. And that's why it has a little different style there, which is dot destructive. You see where it says style dot destructive. So a dot destructive item is going to show up in red text right there. And it's any choice that is going to make a kind of significant unrecoverable action happen. For example, you're going to delete something out of a database. Okay, that might be a destructive action. Obviously, crashing Cassini into the sun, that would be a destructive action. Okay, so that's what dot destructive style is there. And then finally, we have this cancel action at the bottom. You see it's kind of separated a little, and its style is different, dot cancel. That's what causes it to be separated. But a very important other thing about dot cancel is that on the iPad, this thing is not going to slide up from the bottom. It's going to appear in a popover, which we haven't talked about, and we're going to talk all about on Wednesday. But a popover is also modal, kind of takes over the screen, but it appears in a little window. And in there, you can't have a cancel button, because a popover is canceled by touching somewhere else. Okay, popover comes up. If you want to cancel it, you touch somewhere else. So you don't need a cancel. You don't want a cancel button. That's why it's important to note which of your buttons are a cancel button, so that when this appears in a popover, the action sheet here won't include that cancel button. Okay? All right, so we've added our 4 buttons. Now we want this thing to slide up to the bottom and let the user choose and execute the appropriate handler. And we do that with that same method, present. Okay, it's a view controller method, present. Presumably the view controller behind there, you can see that's got the picture of Cassini. That view controller is presenting this action sheet. And it's, present the view controller, animated, true almost always. And then completion handler if you want, which will get called when the animation finishes. Okay, so that's it. Super easy to use an alert. Now, let's talk about, this is an action sheet, by the way. So let's talk about what it looks like on iPad, though. I said it was a popover. This is what it would look like. In this case, you see that little redeploy button? It's kind of small font, but it says redeploy in the upper right of the iPad. When I click that, this action sheet presented. Well, okay, first of all, how do I get it to present like that? And then second of all, how do I get it to point to the little redeploy button? Okay, so I have to do both of those things. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is make it present like a popover. And to do that, I set the alerts, which is a view controller, remember, I set its modal presentation style to be .popover. Okay, and that's going to make it so it presents as a popover. But that's not quite enough, because I have to make it point at that little redeploy bar button item. And the way I do that is I get the alerts popover presentation controller, which will be nil if you're not presenting it as popover. And one of the vars in a popover presentation controller is the bar button item that is presenting it. You can also specify a rectangle, an arbitrary rectangle, and the little triangle will point at that when it appears. You can also specify which direction the little arrow is allowed to point, left, right, up, or down. Okay, and in that way you can control the way this popover presents. Okay, so this makes sense. Now you're probably saying, oh well, I need to put if I'm on iPad, then do this around this, right? Because obviously on an iPhone, I don't want this thing to be a popover. But actually, you don't have to do that, because this exact same code will still slide up from the bottom on an iPhone. Now, why does that happen? Okay, we've specifically asked for the popover presentation style there, and we've specified the bar button item and all that. Well, iOS automatically does what we call adapting to the environment it's in. Both the trait environment, right, compact width or not, and all that stuff we talked about before, but also the platform it's on to some extent. And so here it notices, whoa, I'm on an iPhone, I don't do popovers. Actually, you can do popovers on iPhone, as we'll talk about, but you have to do extraordinary things to do that. So in the normal case of events, it doesn't do poppers, so it comes over in its normal way, okay? So if you're doing a popover and you have a universal app that runs on both iPad and iPhone, you're going to put this modal presentation stuff in there. Okay? All right. So let's talk about alert. Same exact constructor. You just say preferred style alert. Same exact adding actions. Okay, here I have adding my cancel button. I'm marking it as .cancel. Less important in an alert because it doesn't hide the cancel button in any case, because alerts look exactly the same on both iPads and iPhones. And then I'm going to add another action here, which is my login button. Now, my login button is going to use that text field. You see that text field? So how the heck did I get a text field to appear in the middle of my alert? Well, I just said alert, add text field. And the argument to that add text field is a closure that passes the text field to you and allows you to configure it. So this is a password for redeploying Cassini off to the sun or Titan or something. So I want it to have secure text entry. So I'm using the text field var there is secure text entry, which is part of the text input traits protocol that text field implements. And you could do this more than once. You can have more than one text field. I recommend against that. And I generally recommend against using an alert as a login screen. Okay, don't do that for your final project. If you have a login screen, make it a normal part of your UI. Don't have it be an alert. But anyway, once you get this text field added with this and configured, then how do you get the text out when someone types the text? Well, in your handler of the action for login right there, I'm just going to use the var that's in alert called text fields. It's an array of all the text fields. I only have one, so I'm going to get the first one, and then I'm going to get the text out of it. Okay? Couldn't be simpler. All right? Okay, I almost hesitate to show you the alert with the text field in there because it makes you say, oh, that's a great way to get text from the user. But again, alerts are disruptive, so don't use them for that. All right, and I'm going to present this in exactly the same way I presented the action sheet, which with the present method, which presents just all present does is it presents a view controller modally. And of course, this is a mode because the whole screen is dimmed out except for this middle box. All right, and as I said, on the iPad, alerts look exactly the same. Okay, there's no difference. Okay, so that's alerts. So let's put an alert in emoji art just so we can see this in action. And here's the alert I'm going to put in. Right now, emoji art, if you drag any image into emoji art, it'll work. And that's because I have that image fetcher, remember that? And the image fetcher allows you to specify a backup image. Okay? And so if I can't get the image from the URL with the image fetcher, no problem. I'll use the backup image and create a one on disk and use that as the URL. Well, that solution doesn't work too well in iCloud Drive. Because I create an emoji art document on my iPad, I drag in something that I couldn't get its URL, so I just put the image locally, put it on iCloud Drive, I go over to my iPhone, I look at it, I can't see it because it's using the backup image which is on my iPad. So I'm going to fix my emoji art just to simply not accept those things. Okay, so if you drag in something that I can't get its image from the URL, I'm just going to reject it. Now, I could just quietly reject it. Okay, and the user will probably be like, what's going on? I keep dragging this in, it won't take it. But it'd be much better if I put up an alert and said, I couldn't get the image from that URL, sorry. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. However, once I got used to that, then I probably don't want it coming up every time. Okay, because I do get the feedback when I drag in a bad image, it just does nothing. And eventually I'll learn, oh, that one I can't drag in, I'll have to pick something else. And so I'm going to have my alert have two buttons. One is keep warning me about this, and the other one is stop warning me about this. Okay, those are the only two buttons on my alert. And the alert is otherwise just going to say, I couldn't get the image from that URL. Okay, so that's what we're going to build. So let's go do that. To our emoji art, here we are. So here's emoji art. If you remember, we do all of our image dropping down at the bottom here in our drop interaction delegates. See, right here's the image fetcher. Here's where we drop. When we get the URL, we fetch it with the image fetcher. But if we get an image, we use it as a backup image. Okay, so we're not going to do this anymore. Okay, I'm going to, in fact, stop using the image fetcher altogether. So I'm just going to comment that image fetcher out. Instead, what I'm going to do is what you did probably in your homework, hopefully, and what we did last week or the week before in the image view controller, which is I'm just going to fetch this thing directly. Now, one thing I have to be careful about here is I don't want to block the main queue. And this closure, okay, the one that load objects, plural, okay, that I do on a session, this one is a convenience method. It calls on the main queue. Okay, so this closure is on the main queue doing this. So I do not want that. I want to dispatch off of the main queue. So I'm going to do dispatch queue.global queue. Okay, I'm going to do user initiated because the user did just drop this and is presumably asking me to go do it right now. And I'm going to asynchronously perform this block. Okay, and what I'm going to do in this block is go try and fetch that image. So I'm going to say if I can let the image data equal trying to ask the data to get the contents of this URL, but I'm actually going to use the image URL as you learn in your homework. Sometimes you got to massage that URL a little bit to get the right thing out of there. And then I'm going to let image equal a UI image from that data, if I can, image data. And if I was successfully able to do all that, and I'm doing this all in another thread, so it's nice, I'm not blocking the UI. Now I can use this URL absolutely normally. Of course, I want to now dispatch back to the main queue, all right? Because I'm going to do UI thing, which is I'm going to say self.emojiart background image equals the URL and its image. Okay, I'm also going to do self.document changed. This is calling the method that used to be called save. Okay, and then after last lecture, I told you I was going to use delegation to automatically track changes. Well, this is one of the changes I have to track. If you change the background image, I have to let the document know that it's changed. And we're going to look at document change in a little bit later demo today. It's exactly the same as save. I just renamed it to document change, but we definitely want to do that in here. Now, here's the rub. Here's the alert magic. If I couldn't do that, if I was unable to get that image out of there, now I want to put up an alert instead of using that backup image. So I'm going to say here self.present bad URL warning. And I'm going to actually pass the URL along. Now, why am I passing that URL along? I'm not going to do this for time reasons, but you know what would be a really cool thing is someone drags something in, it puts up the alert. They're like, don't warn me again. And they say stop. Okay? But then they drag another one in and it doesn't work. Okay? And then they try a different one, it doesn't work. And they're like, oh, it's broken. Okay? They've kind of forgotten that they said stop warning me that. So somehow you might want that alert to come back on at some point, right? And what would be a cool way to do that? How about if they drag the same URL in twice? Because that's them saying, okay, drag it in. Oh, it didn't work. Why didn't that work? Let me try again. Okay, well, if they're trying again, they probably forgot about that alert. Maybe, maybe not, but it's likely. So that's the kind of thing you can do in your UI that's a little tricky, that allows them to turn things like that back on without having to go to settings somewhere and turn it on, which is really cumbersome. It's just kind of using their natural things that they're doing in the UI, you can make decisions like this. Does that make sense? So I just kind of want to give you this kind of a classic example of that. So that's why I might pass this URL on, because I might want to check to see if it's the same URL. Now I'm not going to do that today for time constraints, but I just wanted to give you the idea you could do that. All right, so let's do our private func here, present bad URL warning for URL. And what am I going to do in here? I'm going to create that alert and present it. Okay, that's why we're here, to learn about alerts. So creating an alert is just creating that view controller. So let alert equal UI alert controller. Why they didn't call it UI alert view controller, I do not know. They did not. Okay, so UI alert controller, and the constructor for it here, we always want this one down here. Okay, you can see this one's that NS coder stuff we learned about before. This is kind of an old style thing. We always want this one right here that gives us the title, the message that's going to go in there, and the style, whether it's an action sheet or an alert. And so our title here, what's happening? Well, they dropped an image, we couldn't get the data. So I'm going to call this thing image transfer failed, maybe. It's actually very important to pick good phraseology here, because you don't want to freak your user out like, oh my gosh, what did I do, or whatever. You want to try and give them something that gives them the authority, kind of projects some authority that this, don't worry, this happened, I understand it, and here's your options. But not something that's so technical that they're like, what? Like if we said something like, couldn't load from URL. Okay, well, users don't even know what URLs are. Okay, so you wouldn't want to put URL in here. You see what I'm saying? So image transfer, when they're dragging, presumably they're trying to transfer that image. It's a good name. Maybe we might want to say image drop failed, possibly. You know, this is the kind of thing you user test and you try and get the right words. Of course, the other thing here is we want to localize this, and I'm going to talk hopefully the week after Thanksgiving about how to localize your app for other languages, because we want our app to run in as many languages as possible. So we have to make that string be able to be localizable, and it's quite easy to do in iOS, but we'll learn about that in a couple weeks. And now here's the message where I'm going to tell them more about what happened. So here I'm going to say that I'm kind of saying what happened here, which is that I couldn't transfer the dropped image from its source. Again, I'm not mentioning the term URL or anything like that. Just doing that. And of course, this is an alert, not an action sheet, so we'll say that. So this creates this view controller, and then I'm just going to present. I am a view controller here. Present. So I can call this method on myself. It's a view controller method, present. I'm going to present the alert, animated, true, and I don't have any completion thing I want to do, so I'll just leave that off. Okay, but of course I need to add my buttons here. So what buttons are going to have? Well, remember I'm going to have keep warning me and stop warning me. Okay, so let's do the keep warning one first. So I'm just going to say alert add action, and remember the action, you can see, takes this one argument, which is a UI alert action, and that has only one initializer, which is this one right here, which I'll make so you can see even better here. All right, so it wants the title. That's the title of the button. So this is the one where I'm going to keep warning the person, and the style for this is just default. This is the normal default button. Keep warning isn't anything special. It's not going to change anything really. We just keep on warning them. And I actually don't need a handler here because I'm not going to do anything if you say keep warning me, because that's what I do by default. So I'm just going to get rid of that. And that's my action. Okay? So a lot of time cancel buttons and OK buttons, they don't have any action. They don't do anything. And this is kind of like an OK button in a way. But our other button, alert add action, UI alert action, this one does have a handler, and let's talk about how we're going to implement this. It's on one page there. So here the string is stop warning. Okay, now if I just have stop warning and keep warning, that's really not enough information for people to understand. What do you mean stop warning? You know what I mean? So I actually want to add a little more to my message up here. I'm going to say something along the lines of show this warning in the future? Question mark? Now, keep warning and stop warning make a lot more sense. Okay, I've added some more things. However, you don't want this to be yes and no. Okay, having buttons in an alert, yes and no, that forces the person to go carefully read and parse the message you said. And they don't get any double check that they read it right before they press yes or no. Okay, so always try to pick things that are more descriptive than yes or no, like keep this warning, stop this warning. Okay, you still have to be brief. You don't want these buttons to have 10 words on them. So it's a compromise between brevity and making sure the person understands. Now I'm going to call this destructive because it's going to stop it doing something that it does pretty much permanently unless I go add that feature where I compare the URLs and turn it back on. So I'm going to set this to destructive. So it's going to turn out red. It's going to make the user think a little bit before they press that, which is exactly what I want. Okay, and how about our handler here? So the handler passes this action back to us. Okay, and we usually don't need that because we can just capture it in using closure capture would capture this action. Although, you know, since you usually add it like this, you don't actually have a local var to this action, so it's kind of nice that it passes it. We don't need it in any case. All we need to do here is set some var that says suppress these warnings. So I'm going to say self suppress bad URL warnings equals true. So I need a var for this. So I'll put that up here. Private var, I think I copied and pasted. Yeah, I did. Equals, of course, it's going to start out false, so we're not going to suppress it. And all I'm going to do is not do this method if that's true. So I'm going to say if suppress your bad URL warnings, not, then do this. Okay? So that's it. This is the entire implementation of this. Let's go see this working. Okay, here's our app right here. Let's open up our Applebee's document right here. Here it is. And let's try dragging in an image that works. Okay, how about, I think this one works. This one has a URL, so we drag it in. It loads it up. Excellent, it works. It's quite a high resolution image. That's good. How about let's drag in one that doesn't work? How about this one? Okay, this one happens to not have a good URL. Whoop. All right, we got an alert here. Couldn't transfer the dropped image from its source. Show this warning in the future. Keep the warning or stop warning. So I will keep warning. Okay, that's good. Let's try another one. How about this one down here? Oh, that also no good. Okay, now I'm tired of this warning, so I'm going to say stop warning me. Okay, now let's try and drag this bad one in again, right here. Whoop, no warning. Okay. All right, so that's that. Let's get back to our slides. And action sheet is exactly the same, right? You're going to do exactly the same thing there. All right. Our next topic here is notifications and KVO. So if you remember back to the MPC talk I did at the very beginning, like second lecture, I had this little radio station, the little orange things right there, and I said, oh, well, the model can't talk to its controller, so it has to use other mechanisms. And why can't the model talk to the controller? Because the model is UI independent, and the controller is fundamentally UI dependent, so there's no way for them to talk in that direction. The controller can talk to the model, but not the other way. So we have this blind and structured way of doing it. By the way, a view might also want to use this radio station to talk to its controller, because the view also can't talk to its controller for a different reason. The view is generic and the controller is specific UI. So there's no way generic items like buttons could know anything about a particular controller. So for both reasons, the view and model can't talk to the controller. Controller talk to them is okay, but can't go the other way. So they both could use this radio station model. Okay, and there's really two ways to do radio stations: notifications and KVO. KVO stands for key value observing. Okay, so we're going to talk about this radio station. By the way, only I call it radio station. It's not called radio station in the doc, but a radio station is a good analogy for the kind of communication that's going on between these things. All right. Okay, here's notifications, the first of these. So a notification is essentially just a way you're going to register a closure to get called when someone broadcasts on a named radio station. Okay, that's all it is. Very, very simple. You can see how it's immediately blind. Nobody knows who's any classes. All we're talking about here is this radio station. Okay, and it's very flexible because you just plop a closure down there and it just calls it when someone broadcasts on that radio station. And it's also possible to broadcast music on the radio station. Okay, in other words, when you broadcast, you can put information across the radio station as well, which is kind of cool. All right, so this is what the function to say I want to listen to the radio station looks like. This code you see up right here. All of this stuff is done via this thing right here, notification center.default. You see that notification center.default, and I'm using it down here. So notification center is a thing that you use both to sign up to listen to a radio station and to broadcast on a radio station. And we always just use this default shared instance of it. Okay, it's kind of like user defaults. Remember that one? We had user defaults.standard. We just used the shared one. Same thing here. Okay, so this method to say you want to listen is called add observer. You're essentially going to observe this radio station to listen to see if anything is broadcast there. And you see it has a return value there, which is of type NS object protocol. I'm going to cover that in a second. But first, let's look at the arguments to this thing. Okay, first of all, we have for name. You see this, right? For name, notification.name. That's the name of the radio station. And notice its type is not string. Okay, it's notification.name. And so when you name it, you will have to create your own notification.name if you want to broadcast on your own radio station, which is fine. You want to give your radio station a unique name. But if you want to look and find the radio stations that exist already in iOS, and there are dozens of them, okay, iOS is very good at broadcasting on a lot of radio stations, you can just go look in the documentation for notification.name, and you'll see them all listed there, okay, what they do, when they broadcast, that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's why it's nice that they made it not a string, but a type that you can go look up in the documentation. All right, the next thing is this object any. Okay, that is who's broadcasting on this radio station, because unlike real radio stations, multiple people can broadcast on the same frequency. okay? And that's perfectly allowed, and this just says who is broadcasting, who did the broadcast that you're receiving when your closure gets called here. And then you see right there we have the queue, this operation queue, okay? That's what queue do you want your closure to be executed on. Now, this can be nil, but you almost never want nil. Okay, what nil means is execute my closure on the same queue as the broadcaster. Okay, you do not want that usually, unless you're the broadcaster. If it's your own code and you're doing the broadcasting, maybe you want that. But if you're listening to something from iOS, for example, no, you probably want the main queue. Now notice that says operation queue, not dispatch queue. And I actually mentioned this when I talked about dispatch queue, that there's an object-oriented API to doing all that dispatch stuff called operation and operation queue. Well, this is using that object-oriented API. If you want the main queue, which is what you want 99% of the time, just say operation queue.main. The same way you say dispatch queue.main, you can say operation queue.main. Okay? And then the last argument to this add observer is the closure you want to execute. And that closure only has one argument, which is a notification. A notification is just a little object that has, for example, the name of the radio station and who the broadcaster is. But it also has a very important piece of information called user info. User info is the music that's being broadcast to you. Okay? It's almost always, it's type any, but it's almost always a dictionary. And when you look in the documentation, notification name, to find all the radio stations, they will say, when we broadcast, we include the following keys in the dictionary, this information. Okay? So that's a very important piece to understand, is that your closure has this one argument notification. You look at the var user info in that notification to get the music that's coming across the radio station right now. All right? Now, let's talk about that return value. You see that observer up there? Notice that really weird type, NS Object Protocol. What the heck is NS Object Protocol? NS Object Protocol is a protocol that NS Object happens to implement. It's a subset of the functionality of NS Object that some objects implement that aren't subclasses of NS Object. Okay, so that, you know, this kind of this well-known set of things. However, that's completely irrelevant here. Okay, does not matter. That thing might as well be an any as far as you're concerned. All this thing, this observer thing is a cookie that just keeps track that basically this observation is this thing. Okay, so it's just a cookie for you to hold on to. You only do one thing with it, which is stop observing. Okay, it's how you say, I don't want to listen to that radio station anymore. Okay, and you do that by asking the notification center .default to remove observer, this cookie, and it will stop listening. Okay, so we'll show you an example of that in a second. Okay, quickly on notification name. All the notification names, they collect them as static lets. Okay, little static let, constant notification.names in the notification.name class. By the way, you'll often see it called NS notification.name. That's the same thing. They're literally type aliased to each other. You know, in the Swift world, we would call it notification, and in the Objective-C world, NS notification name, fine. They're the same exact thing. And again, if you want to create your own radio station, we actually, or I recommend, creating an extension to notification.name and adding your own static let, which is your thing, equals notification.name of some string, any string you want. Okay? That way you'll be collected in exactly the same kind of API realm as all the other notification names. And you'll see that when we do the demo. All right. So here's an example of listening to the radio station. Okay, what's a good example? This is a great example. Remember the slider that sets your font size, the accessibility slider? You can make it bigger and smaller. Well, you can find out because there's a radio station broadcast anytime that changes. Okay, so that's a great thing to know. If you have something in your UI whose font is based on that, for example, we talked about doing the cool thing of having the collection view on the top of emoji art, having its emoji get bigger or smaller based on this slider, okay, which would not be that hard to do. I'm not going to do it as a demo, but you could do it as an exercise. The main thing we would have to do is have our cell size be fixed to this font size by doing our little font metric scaling. And we would also have to have a layout constraint for the height of our collection view that we would want to set in code to be the height of the cells, because remember that our cells can't be larger than our collection view, so we'd have to make the collection view bigger and the cells. But we could easily do that, but if we did that, we would definitely want to be listening to this radio station, because every time that font changed, we'd have to relay out our collection view, of course. All right, so here's what it would look like. We get the notification center default. Okay, we create this observer var, which we set equal to doing add observer. The name of that radio station is notification name UI content size category did change. Okay, it's kind of a mouthful, but that's what it is. We're listening for that from application.shared. That's the application object. I'm going to talk about that at the end of this lecture. You could also put nil there, because basically if anyone broadcasts that thing changed, you're interested. Okay, so it'd be fine to say nil here. That means if anybody broadcasts it. And then, of course, operation q.main, I say or nil, but really we would want .main there because we're not actually sure what thread this iOS would be broadcasting this on. So we want to make sure we're on the main thread when we do our stuff. And then our closure. Now inside our closure, we cause our collection view to redraw. Whatever we do is fine. And also notice there's some music broadcast on this station, which is you can find out the content size category. And so there's names for all those détentes in the slider there, like UI content size category small, UI content size large, UI content size category accessibility large, which is even larger, and there's like very large and extra large. I don't know, there's all kinds of different spots in there that you could look at if you wanted to. But you're probably not going to. You're probably, in that collection view example, just going to resize your font based on the font metrics. Remember how we do that scaled font thing off the UI metrics? You would just cause that to recalculate. All right, now notice that I hold on to var observer right there, okay, and then I remove it when I'm done. So there's a good question here. When do I add and when do I remove observing? Okay, well, almost always you're doing this as part of something you're doing in a view controller. So a perfect time, and probably 90% of the time, when you get view will appear or view did appear, you add observer. And then on view will disappear or view did disappear, you remove the observer. That make sense? Because you're only interested in really getting these size changes while you're on screen. Now if you do that, of course, the size might change while you're off screen. So when you get view will appear, you probably also want to look at the size category, which you can do. UI application has a var for that, and adjust your collection view then before you appear. But it's kind of a waste for you to be listening to that thing all the time and changing things when you're not even on screen. Okay, so view will appear, view did disappear are great places to put add observer, remove observer pairs. Always pair these things. Don't forget to remove observer. Okay, how about broadcasting on your own radio station? Okay, how do you do that? You do that with the notification center default as well. The method there is called post. The first argument, the name, is the name of the radio station. You get to make that up. Okay, we've talked about how to do that. Object, that's you. Okay, that's who's sending it. Usually that's self. You can make it any object you want, but that is who the notification center will report as the sender, the broadcaster. And then user info, that's your music. Okay? And that's almost always you're going to want to put that as a dictionary of any hashable thing to any's. Okay, so it's very flexible. You can put anything you want in there. Now, as soon as you call this method, it will immediately call all the closures for that have add observer to your radio station with the following caveat. It's only going to immediately call them if they specified queue nil, because then it's going to execute their closures on the same queue as this. Okay, so it executes right away. If they specified a different queue, like the main queue, then this is going to post their closures to execute. And it'll execute as soon as that queue gets around to their closure. Okay? So that's notifications. All right, KVO. Now, I'm going to spend 2 slides on this, but I want to emphasize up front, this is not a major important thing. You're going to do this. Most quarters, I don't even talk about this. Okay, but I kind of decided to throw it in this quarter just so you could kind of know it exists out there. It's not really a primary way of doing things. Notification is much more of a primary way. This, much less primary. Okay, and it's because it's kind of limited a little bit in its application. So what is KVO? The basic idea here is, when it comes right down to it, it's the idea of registering a closure that gets executed when a property on a subclass of NS object changes. Okay, that's pretty much what it is. Now, let's talk about some of the caveats I just put there. To make KVO work, okay, you can't just have any property and you change it and someone can register a closure. Think about the overhead of doing that, okay? You would not want that for every property. A lot of properties are probably the access is inlined by the compiler, so there's no way you'll be able to do that. So there's a mechanism that's required to do this. Now, NSObject, remember what NSObject is, right? It's the root of all iOS classes, right? So UI view controller, UI view, they all eventually inherit from NSObject. So NSObject puts this mechanism that makes it possible to watch a property into it. So that's why I say this is for subclasses of NSObject. You could put this mechanism in your own object, however. It's not that difficult. I'm not going to cover it, but people usually don't. They just use the mechanism using NSObject by having their thing, whatever it is, their class, subclass from NSObject. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand. There's kind of some mechanism there that you would have to implement if you didn't want to subclass NSObject. What is this thing good for? What's KVO good for? Well, it's kind of good for some of the same things as notification, blind, structured communication between things, especially between models and their controllers, but also between the view and their controller, or even between a view and itself, as you'll see in the demo here. Not every property works with KVO. As I said, that would be ridiculous. For a property to work with it, not only do you need the NSObject mechanism, but the property has to be what's called key value coding compliant. Now, what that means is that property can be set by sending set value for key, where the key is the key path of that property, and get value for key to get it. In other words, there's this functions, set value for key and value for key, that you can call to get the value of the property. Okay, that has to be possible on the object. That has to work if you want to do it, and that's called key value coding compliant. So the property has to be that way. Now, you have to do some work to make that happen. Okay, properties don't just magically make that work. You usually have to implement something like value for key and set value for key to make that work. Now, there are a few properties scattered throughout iOS that are key value observing, that work with key value observing. Most notably in UI view, center and frame are key value observing. So you can observe the center or frame of a view, and you can find out when it moves. So that's kind of cool. Also, most of the properties in the CA layer underneath UI view, remember the place where we put the border around the view back in assignment 3 or something like that? That layer that's doing a lot of the drawing for UI view, that layer is mostly key value observing compliant. Okay, so you can observe things happening at that layer as well. And there are scattering other places. For example, core data. Remember core data, the object-oriented database? Key value observing can be really big there. Okay, you can watch everything happening in your database on a per property basis by using key value observing. Okay, so there are some frameworks that actually use KVO a lot, but for the most part, we don't use it in the main line that much. And of course, you could make your own NSObject subclass that implements this stuff, but that's way outside the scope of this class. And again, to emphasize, this is not that huge a deal. All right, so how does it work? What does KVO look like? There's this one very important method that NSObject provides for you called observe. Okay, so observe takes a key path as an argument and a closure, and it executes that closure whenever that key path changes. Okay, only works for key paths that are key value compliant, key value coding compliant. Notice that it returns a little cookie. Okay, var observation, you see that? It's a little different than notification though. You never say remove observer on that cookie. Instead, when that cookie goes out of the heap, it stops observing. Okay, so as long as you want this observation closure to be observing that thing, just keep that cookie in the heap. As soon as you let it go out of the heap, it'll stop observing. Okay, now the arguments you see to your closure, of course you get the thing that's being observed handed back to you. You also get this thing change. That change is of type NSKeyValue observed changed, and that's a little object that you can get the old value of the thing, the new value of the thing that changed, that kind of stuff. Okay, it just basically tells you about the change that happened that caused your closure to get called. This key path argument is not a string. Okay, it used to be in the old days. Nowadays, it's actually a typed thing in Swift, and it has a special syntax, which is / the type dot the name of the property. Okay, now Swift will infer the type for you, so we almost always say / dot the property. So for example, if we want to observe the center or frame of a view, we would say observe open parentheses / dot frame. Okay, and that would be observing the view's frame. All right, so I have a demo of both of these things, notifications and KVO. So let's take a look at these. What I'm going to do here is, remember after last lecture I said, oh, we don't want to have a save button in emoji art. We want to get rid of that. There's no reason to have a save button. Really, when we hit save, we were just telling our UI document something changed. So you should auto-save soon. Really what we want is to watch our emoji art view, and whenever an emoji gets added or resized or moved, we want to notify the controller so the controller can tell its document something changed. Then we can just ditch the save button. Well, after lecture last time, I told you I was going to do that, and I did. So the stuff that's posted has this in there. And what I used was delegation. And I did it specifically because I wanted you to see what it looks like to make your own delegate. You've been using scroll views delegate, table views delegate, collection views delegate. I wanted you to see what would make your own delegate. So I created an emoji art view delegate. Okay, and I'll briefly show you what I did there. And so that's great. But today what I'm going to do is use notifications instead. Okay? Because you can imagine anything that's happening with a delegate, that's blind structured communication. Well, we can do that with the notification just by having a radio station, which is the emoji art view something changed radio station. And the controller will just tune in, and every time it hears a broadcast on that, it'll tell its UI document, something changed, that's what I heard on the radio station. And so that's what we'll do there. And then KVO, there's a great use of KVO here, which is right now I had to go down where my gestures are. Remember I dragged in some gesture code. I had to go in there. For every time a gesture changed the position of emoji, I had to tell my delegate something changed. So I had a lot of code in there for that. So I'm just going to rip all that code out, and instead I'm going to observe the center of my emojis. And when my emojis move, or even when they're resized, because when they resize, they have to be repositioned, right? Because they grow from the upper left corner, so I have to keep repositioning. So I'm always setting the center again. So I'm just going to observe that, and when that happens, then I'll broadcast on my radio station. So that'll collect that code into one place and keep it from being spread out through all over my code in a messy way. But before we do that stuff, I'm going to do a simple notification thing, which is I'm just going to observe the state of my UI document changing. Okay? You know how our UI document goes through these document states: normal, closed, progress available when it's reading and writing, saving error. Remember all those states? Well, we're going to watch that happen just to kind of get a warm up on notifications to see what that looks like. So let's do that one. I'm going to go up here. Here's view will appear right here and close, right? So here's our document opening and closing up here. So all I'm going to do here is when my document first appears, I'm going to start watching my document, and it broadcasts on a radio station that tells me when its state changed, okay? So what does that look like? Well, again, I need to capture the return value, so I'm going to call it my document observer equals, let's go ahead and make a var for that. Private var document observer. Remember, it's an NS object protocol optional. Again, it's just a cookie. We never send a message to this ever. We don't even know what messages it responds to. So we're going to create this document observer here. I'm going to do notification center dot default. Okay, that's how we do all of our stuff. I'm going to do add observer. So here's add observer for name. Make this a little easier to read. So I want to do here. I wish they had a little command key I could do that would just do this for me. All right, so we're going to listen to the document state radio station. So let's find the name of it. Okay, I'm just going to type notification.name dot, and you're going to see how many radio stations there are in iOS. Okay, a lot. Okay. And you can go look at all these and what they broadcast and what music they play and all these things. We've already talked about some of these things. For example, keyboard. Okay, here's a keyboard did hide, will show. Okay, that gets notified to you. And then, of course, the content category size did change thing, right? There's that there. So the one we want is UI document state change. You see the first one there? Okay, so UI document state change, that's the radio station we want to listen to. We're only interested in broadcasts from our document. Okay, that's the sender, that's who we want to broadcast. We, of course, want to be on the main queue here. And here's the closure that's going to be executed when someone broadcasts on that. Here's our notification. Now this notification, I think it actually does have some music on there, which is probably the document state, but I don't even need it because I've got my document right here, so I'll just grab its state. I'm just going to say print document state changed to, and we'll say our self.document, document state. I actually added a little extension to document state right there so that it would print it out nicely, .normal, .close, those kind of things. Now, anytime you start listening on a radio station, you immediately have to think, oh, when am I going to stop listening on this radio station? Well, here I'm starting even before my document opens, okay, but I'm waiting until view will appear. So I'm going to stop. I could stop in view will disappear or view to disappear, but I'm actually going to stop when my document is fully closed. Once it's fully closed, I certainly don't want to be watching it anymore. So let's go down here where we close. Okay, this is the close. Here's where we're closing. Right now we don't use the little success closure that happens when we close, but I'm going to start using it. Success in, in space, right, return. Okay, and in here I'm going to remove observing this document observer. So I'm just going to say here, if I can let observer equal my document observer, then I'm going to ask the notification center, default center, to remove that observer. In other words, stop observing that. Okay? Pretty cool with that? Anyone understand what I'm saying here about this is the completion closer from closing a document? Okay, so once it's closed, that way we'll be able to observe it closing. It'll be nice. Okay, so let's go run this and watch our console. So I got my console going down here. Oops, actually, this is my console over here. All right, so let's run. All right, so here's our app. So we haven't opened any documents, so we have nothing on here. I'm going to go ahead and clear out my console. So we haven't opened any documents, so we haven't gotten any document state change. So I'm going to open our Applebee's. Here's our Applebee, and look, document state changed to normal, right? Because we opened the document, now it's in normal. Now, how about putting something in here, maybe an apple, something like that? Now, what's going to happen to the state right now? Okay, well, eventually it's going to autosave. Okay, it does it about, I don't know, once a minute or something like that. But when it autosaves, we're going to notice because it's going to go to state progress available. There it is, progress available, and then back to normal. Because the progress is available because it's saving, and it can tell you the progress as it saves, and then goes back to normal. Okay, I'll show you another trick here. You can force an autosave, by the way, by threatening to switch to another app. Okay, watch this. I'm going to drag up from the bottom like, ooh, I'm going to switch to another app. Okay, this caused an autosave. Now, it didn't do it here because we haven't made any changes, but this is a great way to make sure that your changing stuff works. So watch this. Now I'm going to add something here. Now when I do this threat, whoop, it's saved. Okay, see what happened there? So when you threaten to switch to another app, autosave will autosave because it's just afraid, oh my gosh, I might get killed or who knows what, I better save. So that's a nice trick to know when to do that. Okay, and if we close this, then we get the state changed to closed. Okay, so this is cool. We just listened to that radio station. We're just reporting what happened. All right, now let's go ahead and have our emoji art view be a broadcaster. Okay, we are listening to our UI document, which it's the broadcaster here, and we're the subscriber to the radio station. Now let's go the other way. Let's have it broadcast. So I'm going to go over to emoji art, and what I'm going to do is everywhere where I was doing my delegation, I'm going to use notification instead. So let's first review what I did after last lecture to implement delegation. All right. Now, just like UI scroll view, UI table view, etc., I had to add a protocol for delegation. Now, my delegation protocol, it's called emoji art view delegate, only has one function in it, which is the emoji art view changed. Of course, scroll view has a whole bunch of them. Did scroll, view for zooming at, table views delegate has a lot of things. Height of row at, all these other things. We only have one, just this one. Now, notice I made this restricted to only being implemented by classes. Okay, why did I do that? Because the delegate method, or var, the delegate var in my view, I wanted it to be weak. Okay, and for it to be weak, it has to be able to be in the heap and then get released and set to nil, okay, when no one else is interested in it. Why did I make that weak? Well, imagine here that my controller sets itself as the delegate, which is likely, okay, very, very likely. If that happened, now we'd have a memory cycle. because my view would be pointing to the controller, and of course the controller points to all of its view. Okay, so now they're pointing to each other. They're going to keep each other in the heap. By making this delegate weak, it makes it so that's no longer going to happen. Okay, so there's not a memory cycle because the view is not keeping the controller in memory because this is a weak pointer to it. Okay, so I added this var, this weak var. So now anybody who wants to know if I've changed can just set themselves as the delegate, and of course the controller is going to do that. Then, okay, every time I changed, like right down here, I just sent this message to my delegate, if I have one. My delegate could be nil. I don't have to have a delegate. And I just send it, and of course, I'm the sender, right? Delegate methods, we always send ourselves along as the first argument. You've noticed that, I'm sure, with scroll view and table view and collection view. They always send themselves. That's just for convenience sake, so that you have it right there. So I do that as well. Now, this is not the only change. This is when I'm dropping. Of course, if I drop a new emoji in, that's a change. But I also had to go over here to gestures, and this is what I was talking about before. It's kind of annoying. Like when I select and move a subview, I had to say, oh, well, if this is the end of this gesture, then send this. And also down here where I resized, I had to go and say, well, if it's the end of resizing, send it. Now, I want to get rid of these, and I'm going to be able to with KBO, but we'll leave them in there for now. Okay, so that's delegation. That's all that's necessary on this view side. Then on the controller side, what I did was when I created my emoji art view down here, okay, I set myself as its delegate. Well, if I'm going to be its delegate, that means I have to implement the emoji art view delegate, just like if I was implementing scroll views delegate. And that means I had to actually implement that, which is right here, is my emoji art view delegate method. It's implemented. And what did I do? I call document changed. And what is document changed? Here's document changed. It's the method formerly known as save, okay? Because I ditched my save button when I did this and just called document save. This contents of here is exactly the same as it used to be. Just update my documents model to be my model and then update the documents change count. That's all I do here. Okay, so that's delegation. That's the entirety of it. You see how it all works? Quite simple. And we're gonna not use delegation anymore in this. We're gonna leave delegation in the view, but we're not going to use it in our controller. Instead, we're going to use radio station. So let's go back to our art view and broadcast on a radio station. And I'm just going to do it everywhere where I was talking to my delegate. Instead, I'm going to broadcast on a radio station. I'm just going to say notification center.default.post. That's how we broadcast. And I have to give it a name and who is broadcasting. Well, who's broadcasting is me. And what are we going to do for a name? Well, as I suggested, I recommend going here and doing an extension to notification.name and add your own static let, okay, which I'll call emoji art view did change notification, and set it equal to a notification.name with any string you want in here. I'll probably just use the same string here. It doesn't have to be the same string, but I will. And this will now make it so you can do notification.name.emoji art view did change. Okay, that's the name of our radio station. Remember, radio station names are notification.names, so this is that. So now I can go back down here and say I want my name to be notification.name.emoji art view did change. Okay, by the way, of course, Swift can infer this, so we can just go like that, which is what we would do. We don't want to type all that in notification.name stuff for no good reason. And this is it. So this is that's all we need to do is do this. Now, of course, we need to do it here, but we have to go again over to gestures over here and do it same place we do this delegate right here. And where's this other one up here? Okay, so again, that's kind of annoying. We'll fix that with KBO. But right now, we're broadcasting on this radio station every time something changes. We resize something, we drop something in, whatever. Now, back over here in our controller, I'm no longer going to be a delegate. So I'm going to go down here and just get rid of all this. So I'm no longer going to set myself as the delegate here. Get rid of this entirely. I'm no longer going to implement the emoji art view delegate. I'm no longer going to say that I implement the emoji art view delegate. So now I've disconnected myself from my view. So instead, I'm going to listen to that radio station. So where am I going to do that? That one, let's start listening once the document's open. Okay, until the document's open, it's kind of useless to listen to my emoji art view. So again, I'm going to need another little observer guy here. So I'm going to call this one my emoji art view observer, because that's what it's going to be observing, the emoji art view. I'm going to say emoji art view observer I'm inside a closure here because this is the completion closure of opening, okay? So I'm going to say self.emojiArtViewObserver equals notification center. That's how we listen. Default, add observer, same way as we added observer for the UI document state. Let's put this out again so you can see this all real clearly. All right, so the name is notification.name.emojiArtView did change. Okay, and again, we don't need that. Just I was doing that so we would see it clearly. The object is my emoji art view. That's the only one I'm interested in hearing about emoji art view did change broadcasts. The queue, of course, operation queue.main, because although surprisingly, this would not need to be on main, because all I'm going to do is tell my document, which is part of my model, extended part of my model, I'm just going to tell it that it changed. Okay, that's not anything in the UI. So I don't necessarily have to do that here. I could put nil here and be pretty safe no matter what thread I'm broadcasting on. Now, I happen to know that my emoji art view is broadcasting from the main thread, right? Because it did it when it dropped or when someone resized. Clearly, I'm on the main queue there. Okay, so it wouldn't matter. But anyway, okay, so here we go. Now, we do get this notification. Turns out that our emoji art view does not play any music when it broadcasts. It could maybe send you the label that it added or changed or something, but it doesn't. That's okay. We don't care, because all we want to know is that something changed, so we can say document changed. Right? That's it. Now, of course, we need to stop listening to this. When's a good time to do that? I'm going to do that when you hit close. And I'm going to do it whether or not you successfully close, because I'm going to get dismissed. Okay? So I'm going to definitely stop listening here, and I'm just going to say if I can let observer equal my emoji art view observer, and then I'm going to ask the notification center, the default one, to remove that observer. Okay? And that's it. So this is quite a bit simpler than delegation. Okay? On both sides, it's a little easier to do this. You don't have to implement that other method. You don't have to set yourself as a delegate. You don't have to you just start listening and stop listening, and you're going to find out. So that's why we use notification a lot of times in places where other times we've used delegation. And that's true in other classes as well. All right, so let's go see if we broke anything. Cross our fingers that removing delegation entirely from our emoji art view controller did not break anything. And luckily, we have that other observing going on, so we'll be able to tell. So here's Applebee's. Let's bring up our console there, change to normal, that's good. Now, hopefully, when we drop something in, hopefully that caused radio station broadcasts to happen so that we notice something is different. And hopefully, this is going to auto-save in a moment. And we could force the issue by threatening to go somewhere else. Woohoo, it did it. So it must have been that our radio station worked, and we noticed that change. Otherwise, we wouldn't have auto-saved there. Okay? Okay, the last thing we're going to do is use KVO to rip out some of that code that's calling the delegate and posting down in my gesture view. So I'm going to go, basically what I want to do is go to my gestures right here, and I want to remove this code. You see, this is the code where I'm telling my delegate and posting on the radio station when, in this case, something moved. So I want that out of there. And then down here for resize, okay, this is when we resize, I want this out of there. So I'm just going to delete that. But I obviously still need to tell people when I've changed. So I'm going to go back to my art view here. And as soon as I add a label, I'm going to have that label be observed for its center changing. And if its center changes, I'm going to notify my delegate and broadcast on my radio station. I'm basically going to do this right here. So how do we do that? Okay, the trickiest thing about this, it's actually quite easy. We're just going to do label observe, observe, and what property are you observing? /dot center, okay? And when we observe, we get a closure. The closure is going to pass the label back to us and that little changed object right there. And we can do whatever we want in here. And what do we want to do? We want to do this. Tell our delegate and tell the radio station something changed. But remember, observed returns a cookie. Okay? And we have to keep that cookie in the heap as long as we want this to happen. So I'm going to do that by having a little private var, which I'm going to call my label observations, okay? Which is going to be a dictionary with UI views as the keys and these NS key value observations as the values. Okay? Now, putting things in this dictionary is going to keep things in the heap, but only as long as this emoji art view is in the heap. As soon as this emoji art view leaves the heap, this will leave the heap, and all the observations will leave the heap. Woohoo! Okay, so that's what's great about this, not having to do that remove observer thing like you do with notifications, because when things leave the heap naturally, the observations naturally stop. However, what if we don't leave the heap and we remove that subview? Okay, we don't actually have any UI to remove our emojis. That once they're in there, they're there forever. But we could imagine putting some sort of gesture that would remove them. So we want to anticipate that day, and I want to make sure we remove it. So first of all, let's put the observation, key value observations in here. I'm going to say label observations sub the label equals this observation. Okay, so this is the label observation for this label, right? Now I have to, whenever this view gets removed from SuperView, I have to let this observation leave the heap. In other words, I have to remove it from here. Everyone understand that? So how do I do that? Well, luckily, there is a nice method in Vue called will remove subview. Okay? And of course, we're going to call super will remove subview. And this gets called anytime a view gets removed from me, which is perfect. Okay? All I'm going to say here is I'm just going to check to make sure that this view that's being removed is actually in the label observations here. So I'm going to say if label observations sub that subview, oops, does not equal nil, okay? In other words, we have an observation for it. Then I'm going to set the label observation for that subview to nil. Boom, it just left the heap. Okay, as soon as I clear that thing out of this, it went away, it stops observing, which is exactly what I want. Okay, everyone got that? So that's all we need to do this. Let's make sure we didn't break anything here. Okay, so we got our Applebee's right here. Let's change something. Okay, let's take this 8-ball, move it over here. And then let's try and threaten, oops, let's get our console up here. Console, move it back to here. Okay, let's threaten to go somewhere else. Woohoo, it auto-saved, okay, it worked again. All right, sound good? Okay, back to our slides. Timing here. Okay. Now you'll remember we talked about the Vue controller lifecycle, right? Vue will appear, Vue did appear, all these things. Well, the same kind of thing happens with your application. And it kind of goes through this chart up here. So I'm going to talk about how it transitions through all these stages. But first I want to talk about the stages. So first of all, there's foreground inactive. And that is a place where your code is running, but you're not getting any UI events. So you can't do anything. Okay? So you can only do kind of preparation work in this space. Then there's foreground active. This is the normal state you're used to. Getting UI events, you do Vue controllers coming on screen, segueing, you're doing all your stuff. This is the normal running state of your app. Then there's background. Okay, in the background, your code is running. You're not getting a UI events. You never live here for long, maybe 30 seconds. Okay, so this is a transitory state. So anything you do in the background state, you got to do it fast. And then you go into the state suspended. Here, your code is not running. It's important to understand no code in your app anywhere runs. Okay? Your app is not getting any CPU cycles. Now, what's important about this state is that you could be killed at any time in this state. Okay? All right, so let's talk about how we transition here. One transition is launching your app. So when you launch your app, you go from not running, where your binary is not even executing, to briefly the foreground inactive state and then the foreground active state. So you do pass through that foreground inactive state briefly on your way to running when you launch. Now another important one is when you switch to another application, right? So you're the active app, someone's using you, and then they switch to another app, okay? And when that happens, you go up to foreground inactive for just a moment, and then all the way down to background. You sit in the background for maybe 30 seconds, and then you move to suspended. And now from suspended, either you get reactivated if they come back to you, or you get killed at some point. Okay? So those are the transitories. And when you get killed, you go directly from suspended to not running. You don't pass through some state where you get to run any code. Okay? All right, so let's talk about how you get notified for all of these transitions, what happens, and what you're supposed to do. Okay? Now, all of these things I'm going to tell you, by the way, not really that important, because a lot of things are taken care of for you. For example, UI document. You notice how when we threatened to go to another app, it auto-saved. Okay? It knows about these transitions. It's doing that for you, so you don't need to do anything. And that's true of a lot of things in iOS. So I'm going to show you all these things and the ways to do it, but most of the time you don't need to do anything. Okay? But just need to know that these transitions are happening. All right, so the first transition is from not running into this inactive state, this foreground inactive. This is kind of like preparing your app. When this happens, like all the things that happen here that I'm going to talk about, a method in your appdelegate.swift, you know that stepchild that we keep foisting off into supporting files. Actually, we did look at it last time. Remember, it had the thing where you open a URL. Remember, we had that little code in there that we're talking about, that UI document browser view controller handles opening a URL for us. Okay, so we have looked in there, but there's a lot of methods in there, and that's what all of these transitions have, is they call methods in there. And you'll see there's stubs in there. If you go look at it, there's stubs in there that have commented out stuff that kind of tell you about them. So this is all pretty well documented in there. By the way, all of these transitions also are broadcasts on radio stations. Okay, so you can just sign up and put a closure, and when these transitions happen, a closure can be executed. All right, so that's important to know as well. Not so useful for the very first one, which is application will finish launching with options. An application did finish launching with application, because that's one of the first times you actually get to run your own code. Okay, and notice that that thing has a little dictionary passed in. Right, application will and did finish launching with options. That dictionary tells you why you were launched. Okay, now why would you be launched? Well, of course, the user might have touched on your icon. That's most of the time. But you can also get launched because someone wants you to open a document. Okay, we're Emoji Art, and somebody wants us to open an Emoji Art document, and we're not running. We could get launched to do that. You can also set up things where you get launched when the user walks by a dry cleaner. Okay, you can actually register a place in the world and walk by, boom, you'll get launched. Okay, you can also have this activity continuation thing where you're working in Emoji Art on your iPad, and then you switch over to your iPhone, and then in the corner there's a little icon you press. Now you're right back in Emoji Art where you were. Well, that might have to launch you. Okay, you might get a push notification. You're using CloudKit, something in your database changed. You get woken up to say, hey, look, got a push notification for you. So there's a lot of reasons you can get woken up and launched, and that dictionary will contain all the information you need to know about why. It used to be that an application will and did finish launching, we built our UI. Okay, we created a split view, we created a navigation controller, we put a group view controller. We never do that anymore. I only mention this because in your final project you're going to go out and Google things and look in the internet, and you're going to see people say, oh, go create a split view and your application did finish launching with options. No, we don't do that. Okay, storyboards, that's how we do it. Those answers were pre-storyboard, okay, or someone who never got the storyboard story, okay? We build our UI in storyboards, not in this method. All right, the next transition is actually coming to that inactive state from the other side. You were the active app, and now you're not going to be the active app, probably because the user clicked on another app. This one is application will resign active, because that's what's happening. Here you want to think of this as the pause button. You want to pause whatever's happening in your app right here. So let's say I use the example of an asteroids game. Okay, you're shooting asteroids. You want the whole asteroid field to pause when you get this. Okay? And then the next one here is inactive to active. That's unpause. Okay? So this is application did become active. So you kind of want to have a pause, unpause thing here. Now, there's a lot of apps, it doesn't make sense. You never pause or unpause. They're not that kind of app. Okay? They just are what they are. So you don't have to do anything. But if you have an app where things would make sense to pause, this is where you pause and unpause in these two things. Okay? Now, this one right here is someone clicked on another app. you've gone through active, inactive. Now you're going around to this background state. Okay, this is application did enter background. Okay, it's time right here to batten down the hatches. Okay, close your files. Get yourself in a situation where you could be killed. You got about 30 seconds here to prepare to be killed. You might not be killed, but you might be. So you want to not have any files open that are going to get corrupted if it gets closed, or an unsaved data in your close things up here. Okay, that's what it is. And you get 30 seconds to do it. You can ask for an extension, short extensions of time, but if you ask too much, the system will stop granting you those extensions. So pretty much think about you got 30 seconds or so to get your hatches battened here. Okay? The next one here is application will enter foreground. So here, you went down the background view, you battened down the hatches, and you got activated again. You didn't get killed. Here you want to unbatten down the hatches, okay? Open back up the things that you had closed. Now, a lot of times you don't need to do anything here because you're opening up things that you close in the battening down the hatches on demand anyway. If you try to access a file and it's not open, well, you'll just open it then, okay? So oftentimes you don't have to do anything here, and I kind of recommend writing your code in that way so that you don't really have to ever unbatten down the hatches. Okay, so that's all the things that happen, and all those things you get radio station, all those things that have methods in the app delegate you can do. But the app delegate does some other things as well in there. For example, the opening URL thing we saw last time. It also can do background fetching, okay, which is kind of cool. Let's say you have a Twitter client or something like that, and when someone relaunches your app, you want to show them the latest tweets. Well, you can actually set up your app to fetch the latest tweets in the background, even when your app is not running. And what will happen is it'll get launched, but it won't come on screen, and you'll be in that background state for a little bit of time where you're allowed to make a couple of network requests for your 30 seconds or whatever, and then you go back to sleep. Okay, so you can do that with the app delegate. It also manages data protection. I don't know if you know this, but when your device is locked in the lock screen, apps cannot see the data. It's encrypted. Okay, it is fully encrypted, so the apps couldn't do anything if they wanted to. So the app delegate will tell you what's going on about when you can access the files, things like that. Okay? There's also a UI application, which the app delegate is the delegate of. We never subclass UI application. We use the app delegate to configure its functionality. However, UI application does have a few interesting things, like it has a method so you can open a URL in another app. Okay? So your image gallery, and maybe you ask to open an emoji art document, you can ask using that open URL. Here's where you register for push notifications. So this is something you have to do if you want that CloudKit thing to notify you. You have to register for push notifications there. You can set the fetch interval for that background fetching I talked about. Here's where you ask for more time if you're in the background mode and you need a little bit more time to finish up. That's happening in UI application. The little spinner in the top left of your device that says there's network activity, that's controlled with this bool. Unfortunately, it's a bool. So if you have multiple threads accessing the network, they've got to share this bool, which is kind of annoying. But and you can also find out about things like how much time do I have left to run in the background? What is that preferred content size category? You know, the slider for the font size. What state am I in? Am I in the foreground, the background? Where am I? You can find all those things out with UI application. All right, quickly, info plist. We already saw info plist in your homework. You used it to add that app transport security, right? You can actually edit this directly in XML. You just right-click on it and switch to source as XML. You can do that. The only reason you would ever want to do this, sometimes you will get a snippet of XML from somebody that does something, enables something in your plist, and you're going to paste it in here. Okay? But usually we don't even edit the plist thing directly like we did with app transport security. We edit it in the project settings like we did with document types, right? The document types we had for emoji art view and for your image gallery, we edited that all in project settings. Okay? And the project settings is mostly editing the info plist indirectly. And finally, we have capabilities. We talked about this with CloudKit. There are certain things that to use them, you have to turn them on. Okay? This capabilities tab inside of your project settings, like this. Some of these things require servers, like Apple Pay and iCloud and Game Center. Some don't, like Maps and Inter-App Audio, HomeKit, none of those do. The things that require a server, you can only turn these on if you are a member of an Apple developer program. Okay, that costs $99 a year. And you can kind of see why that is, because to access these server technologies, there kind of needs to be stuff in that server that knows about you and is providing your stuff. Well, they got to know who you are for real. You can't just be some random Apple ID out there. You want to be registered in the program. And the $99 seems to me mostly an administrative fee. It's not very much money for the amount of functionality that you're getting with all these servers, push notifications, all these things. It's all covered in one $99 per year fee. I don't have time to cover all these, but this is a great place to go look for interesting, not covered in lecture things to do. Okay, go look through this list and see if you can find something fun to do in there. All right, that is it. On Wednesday, we're going to talk about super important topic, and this is the last topic I cover really before you launch into your final projects this week, which is segues. Okay, we know about show segues and show detail segues, right? The navigation controller and split view controller. And we know about modal segues too a little bit. We put up our emoji art document modally, but we're going to learn popover segues more than just for alerts, but popover segues in general. Also unwinding segues and embed segues, two kind of underappreciated segues that you can do that are kind of cool. We're going to learn all about that, and I'll be demoing it all on Wednesday as well. Okay, next week is Thanksgiving, so you get a week off. That'll be great, and then we'll be back at it the week after. All right, see you on Wednesday.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.